Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome you to our MATS Final Changes webinar. My name is Anna Wilson. I'm the Corporate Marketing Manager here at ESC Spectrum. Our webinar today is hosted by Jon Konings, Senior Regulatory Specialist. He's got a lot of really great information in this presentation to give to you. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Jon.
Thanks, Anna, and welcome everybody today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule to sit in on this webinar today. But the first and foremost thing I want to mention this morning is that the purpose of this webinar is to enhance your awareness of the recent changes made to the EGU MATS rule. These changes were published in the Federal Register on September 9th, and some of the changes actually began on September 9th. Others kick in January of the next year, and the final set of changes actually occur in the first quarter of 2024. And so because of this sort of staggered triggers that are occurring, we're trying to bring these items to your attention so that you can investigate them yourselves. You can review how these changes are occurring and determine how they're going to impact your facility. And because there are so many different ways of demonstrating compliance with the MATS rule, it's really hard for me to help you understand how the changes are going to impact you. So what I'm trying to do today is bring up the major topics that I have reviewed and hope that you can therefore look at these topics and review how they either will fit in or will change your compliance strategy as you go forward. I also want to point out that significantly more information is going to be required for the MATS reporting requirements that occur starting January of 2024. And a lot of the information that's going to be required to be submitted, it does not come from the DAS system per se. A lot of it comes from other operating information, and we're going to talk about that during this morning's presentation. So let's get into the fun part. So again, why are we here? We're here because of these various changes that occurred in the Federal Register. That was the final rule that was published in the Federal Register back on September 9. Moving forward, like I said, there are four major ways that compliance can be demonstrated, and each option needs to be reviewed carefully, and these changes need to be reviewed against the compliance options that you've selected at your facility. And again, a quick review there is periodic testing, periodic stack testing that's available. There's continuous monitoring that you can use. There's emission averaging, and I don't think too many people are really using that. There's also work practice standards. So there's lots of different things that people have to be aware of. Moving on, like I mentioned before, Table 3 associated with the regulation talks about work practice standards. And these are things such as performing tune-ups of your boilers, reporting the fuel consumptions, things like that. And as all regulations, record keeping and reporting is an ever-evolving challenge, keeping track of everything that you need to keep. And the semi-annual compliance reports that you currently are using are being replaced with quarterly compliance reports, starting with the first quarter of 2024. And as I mentioned before, some changes became effective immediately as when the Federal Register came out. Some took place, some began taking effect on November 9th, and some will start again, like I said before, as late as January 1st of 2024. So let's start working our way through these things. I basically reviewed the preamble to the Federal Register, and people say, well, why do you want to look at the preamble? Why don't you look at the actual regulations themselves? Well, that's because the preamble is where the agency typically explains the reasoning behind the changes they're making. They'll give you the background of why they're making the changes. And sometimes they do a good job of explaining what's going on, and other times they don't. But I like to look at the preamble so I can see if they did provide a reasoning, why these changes are being made, so I can understand it better. And right here on this slide, I've provided a link to where you can find the information about the EGU MATS rule, the Mercury and air toxic standards that we have here. And I also included a little screenshot of the actual page itself to help you familiarize yourself with what you're looking for. Moving on, in today's discussion, I tried to group the changes into similar categories. Similar changes to each other. I tried to group them together that way. So there are changes for that are specifically for periodic testing. There's other changes that are related to the continuous monitoring. There's also changes for the emission damaging plans that people are using. And there are changes that apply across multiple strategies, or I also say they are generally applied. And then we're going to talk about the changes to the appendices. And the appendices are really the key that you need to focus on. There are 3 new appendices, and especially Appendix E, which is titled Data Elements, is going to play an important role for you as we go forward, especially starting in the first quarter of 2024. That's where a lot of the electronic reporting that you're going to be doing for the first time is going to take place, and it relates to the specifications of Appendix E. So with that being said, let's move forward again. Periodic testing changes. This is really addressed, like I said before, in the data elements area of Appendix E. And the results, the actual data itself and the actual results of periodic stack testing is handled through sections 14 through 29 of Appendix E. And we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail in a few minutes. But I also want to point out that this reporting of reference method data that's collected by your stack testers, there's a whole lot of data that's going to be required to be reported. And you should be aware that it would be better, far better, if you could get a comma separated value formatted file from your stack testers and import it into StackVision. And that way you can insert it into the database electronically instead of having to hand enter all these data sets. And so if you're not familiar with this process, I can tell you that StackVision can already accept certain types of CVS files, but you need to get those files from your stack testers. And so if they're not aware of this, you really need to make them aware of it, that you want to import these files, and that manual entry of all this data into StackVision would be very labor intensive, and also you'd be exposed to a lot of manual entry errors, making those keystrokes. So be aware that you need to focus on being prepared to import these files electronically. Let's move on to continuous monitoring changes, and we'll have a series of slides here talking about this. First off, for the first time, they're going to be reporting of PM concentration data related to those PM SEMs that you have, and also related to the RADAs that you perform, the PM correlation tests, the RRAs and the RCAs, and all that sort of stuff will be submitted electronically in the EDR format. Now, in the slide, we mentioned the XML format, and I just want to pause for a second and remind you that the ECMPS tool is being changed. It's being replaced by a web-based tool, and the file format is also changing. And it no longer will be a XML format, but it will be a JSON format. And that will be a little bit different than what we're used to and experiencing. But again, the changes you're going to be will include electronic reporting of hourly PM concentrations and emission rates and other related data. I want to point out that currently the ECMPS tool uses the evaluation of these checks to assess the quality of the various types of MATS related data, whether it be Mercury data, HCl data, HF, SO2, or even PM data. And I've included a citation where this is all laid out for you, so you can go back and read where it's specified in 63-10,031. You'll also be reporting for the first time 30 and 90-day rolling averages for the various types of emission rates. And that will begin reporting them electronically in the first quarter of 2024. Lastly, these rolling averages will be part of the quarterly compliance report that is specified in Appendix E of the reporting rule. And so I highlighted here that it's quarterly compliance reporting. Right now you're doing semi-annual compliance reporting, but starting in January of 2024, you'll be switching to quarterly compliance. The interim reporting for HCL will be discontinued as of January 1st in 2024. And for further details explaining this, I pointed out here that you need to read 63-10,031, subparagraph A2. And that's where it spells this out a bit more in detail. I also want to point out that a separate certification statement is required for both Part 75 and the MATS reporting program. And these two separate certification statements can make preparing these files a little bit more challenging if you don't have the same responsible official for both the Part 75 acid rain program and for the Part 63 MATS program. So this is all specified in 63-10,031A5, and you really need to take a look at that to make sure you understand how that needs to be fulfilled. I also point out here that EGO owners and operators are going to discontinue submitting their semi-annual compliance reports when the interim PDF reporting period ends at the end of 2023. And again, the rolling averages that are previously being submitted as a PDF file will now become part of the quarterly compliance report and submitted electronically. So this is a significant change that will take place in the 2023-2024 timeframe. Moving on, there are some changes for the emission averaging plans. In Section 8 of Appendix E is used to report the data related to the emission averaging plan. And I know not a lot of people use emission averaging plans, but I wanted to bring it up to your attention in case you are one of those types of people that uses an averaging plan, and you really should read the requirements of Section 8 for Appendix E a little carefully so that you make sure you understand what's being required of you. Moving on, let's talk about the general changes, and there'll be a number of slides here that we're going to talk about. Specifically, the ECMPS tool and its replacement actually will become the exclusive tool for MATS reporting. The PDF interim reporting process will continue to be used through the end of December 31st of 2023, and it will be discontinued beyond that point in time. And as I said before, the reporting of 30-day or 90-day rolling averages is expanded to include not only Mercury and HCl and HF, but to include SO2, and will begin the first quarter of 2024. And again, like I said before, these rolling averages will be part of the quarterly compliance report required by Appendix E. The interesting, the interesting part for the new quarterly compliance reports that they are due within 60 days following the end of the calendar quarter, not 30 days, but 60 days. And I expect there to be some questions as we get closer about how this is exactly going to work out. And the quarterly report includes the applicable elements that are listed in sections 2 through 13 of Appendix E. So again, you need to look at Appendix E and see what's going to be required of you, because it's going to require that a lot of information be gathered or brought together from other sources that are not necessarily related to the DAS at all. So you need to be aware of that. One other area that's really going to be an important change is the reporting of downtime. This went into effect actually when the Federal Register came out on September 9th, and that downtime events associated with malfunctions and out of control periods can be considered to be deviations. Excuse me. A deviation from the monitoring requirements contained in the MATS regulations are failures to collect quality assured data due to either a monitoring system malfunction, a monitoring system out of control periods, or any periods of repairs associated with the monitoring system malfunction and out of control period. And if you've looked at this in any detail, you understand that the definition for downtime associated with deviations is a very confusing section of the regulation, and I'm going to share it with you in a second here. And I want you to focus on it because, again, this change it went into effect back on September 9th. And so the first time you're going to have to deal with reporting these downtime events as potentially deviations is when you submit your next semi-annual compliance report, which will be in January, which is next month. And here I copied the actual wording out of the regulation. And again, this is 63-10,020D. It's very confusing because of the way it's written, and I think it's poorly written, to be very honest. Let me read it to you for a second. It says that periods of monitoring system malfunctions or monitoring systems out of control periods, repairs associated with those monitoring system malfunctions or monitoring system out of control periods, and required monitoring system quality assurance or quality control checks, excluding zero and span checks, must be reported as time the monitor was inoperative, or in other words, downtime, under 63.10 subparagraph C. So what it basically is saying is if you have downtime related to a failure or related to performing a quality assurance check, like a linearity or other quality assurance checks, those are to be considered downtime and a deviation if they're not associated with a daily cal. So it's very confusing. So I urge you to read this section carefully and make sure you understand it, because I find it so very confusing. Like I said before, the reporting of downtime has changed under MATS, and that started back on September 9th, 2020, when this final rule appeared in the Federal Register. And I also want to point out that downtime is reported as a monitoring system basis, not a monitor basis. And I know from working with various customers over these past several years that some customers report their downtime on a monitor basis. So in other words, when a NOx monitor is failed the calibration or something and is not producing valid data, people report the NOx monitors as having downtime. But under their MATS program, it is not a monitor downtime, it is the monitoring system that we're concerned about. And therefore, any component of the monitoring system can affect downtime. So for example, if you were doing preventative maintenance on your sample probe or on the sample line itself or the sample line heaters, if any one of those activities caused you to not record valid data, that would be considered downtime and potentially a deviation. And this definition extends to the DAS as well, because the DAS is a part of the monitoring system. So if you had some sort of communication failure between your data controller and the central computer, and you were not able to retrieve that data later on, that data gap in your database would also be considered to be required to be reported as downtime. And again, some downtime events are also considered to be deviations. And so today, the excess emissions and deviations reported is performed and required under 63-10,031D, under that subparagraph. And as in the past and going forward for the next couple of years, they'll be reported using a PDF report and is submitted semi-annually. But starting January 1 of 2024, they will be reporting of the excess emissions and deviation will become part of the quarterly compliance report in the format described in section 13 of Appendix E. So Appendix E is used for a lot of different reporting purposes, and we'll talk a little bit further about that in a few minutes here. Let's talk about PM SEMs. And this is one area that I think people may have overlooked, that in Table 8, which is at the end of the regulations, Table 8 is for reporting requirements, and Item 13 is about reporting of the certification-related data for PM CEM systems. And it says prior to November 9 of 2020, if you began using a certified PMCM systems, if you haven't done so already, you need to submit within 60 days of November 9th, 2020, a copy of that certification package that you developed so that you could use the PMCMs. And if you haven't submitted that information previously to the agency, you're asked to do it again, to submit a PDF formatted file to the agency so that they have on file the current certification application that you prepared for using the PMCM systems. Furthermore, it goes on to say that if you do a correlation testing that is completed after November 9th of 2020, but is before January 1st of 2024, you must submit that same certification PDF report no more than 60 days after which the test is completed. And then, if you perform any correlation testing or certification related activities after January 1st, 2024, instead of submitting a PDF file, you'll now have to submit that appropriate information following the requirements specified in Appendix E. So again, everything kind of comes back to Appendix E. That's where you'll handle submitting all this data and information electronically. So even if you haven't done this for a while, you really need to go read those appropriate sections of Appendix E so that you understand what kind of data you're going to need to gather so that you can both submit the PDF files today as necessary and then set up the correct files in Appendix E following the appropriate sections there. And so when I thought about this for a second of saying, okay, if you haven't submitted your certification documentation or your certification application to use your PMCMs, if you're going to put that together and get that in before that 60-day deadline, what sort of information should you include? So what I'm suggesting, the package should include the information required in section 7.2.4 of Appendix C, which again specifies the certification, recertification, and quality assurance checks that you're supposed to perform. I'm also suggesting that you would include in that package a copy, a hard copy of the EPA's spreadsheet. You might remember, if you're using PMCMs, that the EPA has a spreadsheet in which you enter all the PM correlation data, and it analyzes the data 5 different ways and tells you which correlation, which analysis method gives you the best results, whether it be polynomial or a power curve or a linear curve or whatever. And so I suggest it might be a good idea to back up your claim of which curve you're using. You should include a hard copy of that spreadsheet along with your certification package. I would also look at the information required by the reference method data that's listed in sections 17 through 31 of Appendix E, because that's what you're going to have to submit in the future electronically. So you probably should include that information in the hard copy today. And I will also suggest you include a cover letter describing the contents of the package, which curve was picked and why, and the date and the hour the curve was entered into the DAS so that the raw PM data can be automatically adjusted by the DAS. So I'm suggesting here what this certification package should contain. Now moving on, again, I'm sure it seems like I'm harping on this topic, but quarterly compliance reports begin on the first quarter of 2024. They're due within 60 days following the end of the quarter and includes information specified in sections 2 through 13 of Appendix E again. And some of these sections are relevant to you, but they really are dependent upon what is your compliance strategy. So again, you need to review Appendix E and figure out what is your compliance strategy and what elements of sections 2 through 13 you need to report. I also want to point out that these quarterly reports will contain other information outside of emissions data, such as the dates for when boiler tune-ups occurred, monthly fuel usage, and information on process and control equipment malfunctions, plus the reporting of deviations and when any emergency bypass equipment was used. So you can see a lot of this information is not in the DAS, and a lot will have to be collected from other data sources at the plant. And so it is assumed that most of this data can be hand entered, so it can be included in the electronic files. So I'm assuming that ESC and Spectrum, that the StackVision software and the Prism software will be updated in the next couple of years to have fields available where you can manually enter this information, like the boiler tune-up dates and monthly fuel usage and all that other information. But I would really suggest that you look this information over now, and you can figure out a checklist so that when the time comes, you know exactly where to go and get all this additional information. So I'm suggesting that you plan ahead and prepare ahead so that you can pull this data together in a fairly easy and straightforward way. Now, I also want to point out that in Appendix E, Section 13 specifically addresses the nature of those deviations that we talked about before. They talk about the nature of the deviation, the description of the deviation, and the corrective action that was triggered by that deviation. And this is a lot of information that people may or may not be aware of. And so that's why I'm bringing it to your attention today. And again, malfunction information is also going to be included in that quarterly report. And other information related to your CPMS systems, your continuous parameter monitoring systems that are outlined in Appendix D to the MATS rule are also going to be required. And so if you are one of those few people who are operating CPMS systems, you really need to focus on Appendix D and to look at the appropriate sections of Appendix E for the electronic reporting of that information. Now let's talk about Appendix A. Appendix A is for mercury monitoring. And there were just a couple of changes to Appendix A, and I'll call out some of the major ones here. First off, it did clarify in Section 5.11 that the required daily calibrations can be performed offline for our mercury monitoring system. And other than RADAs, the other QA tests that are required can be performed at any load level. RADAs must be performed at the normal load level, just as it's done under the acid rain program. But doing linearities and system integrity checks and things like that can be done at any load condition. Section 7.1.1.2.1 states electronic reporting is going to be required for emission controls. And I'm not sure what that really involves, but I thought it was important enough to mention here today that, again, I suggest that people look at that so that they can figure out in advance what this is really requiring. There are sections on the appendix that talk about how hourly mercury concentrations and emission rates are to be rounded and then reported. And so that was an area of some confusion for people in the past. So I also suggest you take a look at that. And it also specifies that monitoring plan information, any updates that you will make to the monitoring plans as it relates to mercury systems, need to be submitted at least 21 days before the compliance dates that were specified in the regulations. Take a look at that as well to figure out what you need to do there. Let's talk about Appendix B. And Appendix B is for HCl and HF monitoring. And I know that there are not a lot of facilities, I think probably less than 10 in the United States, that use these. And so I'm not going to read through this in any detail, other than say if you have HCl or HF monitors, take a look at the slide and the items I call it here so that you know what's going to be happening to your reporting, both as it continues going forward and to changes that are made for electronic reporting that is going to occur on January 1st, 2024. And for you, again, for HCl and HF monitors on this slide, you can see that a lot of the reference method data that are used, that is collected and is used for your reporting, is going to be reported using section 17 through 31 of Appendix E again. So again, you need to review Appendix B and then review Appendix E so that you understand what your data reporting requirements are. This slide mentions the provisional status that can be claimed for HCl and HF monitors. And that's because frequently the type of reference method data collection that is required, these types of tests require samples to be collected in the field and then sent off to a lab where the final analysis is performed and the results are recorded. And until that data is available, the hourly data can be marked as provisional, and until such time as you actually get that data that comes back. And if that data is satisfactory, then that provisional data can become regular data. So again, if you operate an HCl or HF monitor, you need to read these slides a little bit more carefully so that you understand the benefit of using provisional data and the requirements of using that. Moving on, let's talk about Appendix C, which is for PM monitoring, and this relates to PM CEM systems. And I would read the changes very carefully because it does depend upon what type of PM monitor you are using, whether it's a beta gauge or a light scattering device or other things related to that. It does specify, the changes do specify how data is to be rounded and reported and other ways of handling the data, and it relates to the quality assurance checks required by the PM systems. So again, I'm just trying to bring this to your attention to make sure that your system is configured to meet these reporting requirements. And you should probably review all this stuff now that this information has become available. And the last one is for PM monitors. Again, section 7.1 of Appendix C talks about the monitoring plan records and keeping hourly data related to operating parameters such as PM concentrations, diluent gas concentrations, stack gas flow rates, moisture content, and all this other information like that. And so this record keeping has always been a challenge for people. And again, I would stress that you take a look at section 7.1 in Appendix C to see what data types and records you're required to keep. This slide is talking about Appendix D, when Appendix D is PM CPMS monitoring systems. A CPMS is called a continuous parameter monitoring systems, and I'm not aware of too many people using these systems. And so I've called out here where the changes that were identified for the Appendix D systems. And if you have these type of systems, you really should review the changes for Appendix D to see how it's going to impact your system and what changes are going to be necessary for you. And then moving to the last section, let's talk about some of the changes to the overall appendices themselves. For example, Appendix D and E Appendix C, which is for PM monitoring, Appendix D, which is for PM CPMS, and Appendix E, those are three brand new appendices. So if you have systems that fall under Appendix C or D, you need to read those. And just about everybody is going to have to use various sections and parts of Appendix E to do their reporting. And here I give you a breakdown of some of the sections within Appendix E, and you can see they're all over the place. And a lot of the information that's required by Appendix E does not originate in the DAS itself, and is not necessarily related to emissions themselves. For example, fuel usage. That's one area that you're going to have to report. And there's other sections like Section 10 that talks about unit information or information related to the configuration of your unit that you're going to have to report electronically using the requirements of Appendix E. And here I broke down even further some of the sections, and you can see that this is all related to the reference method testing that you're going to be doing. It looks at the individual runs, the three runs per each reference method test, looking at both the results of the data collected and the actual data itself for each run. So it's all quite detailed and quite laborious. And this is where I mentioned before, where if you can get a CSV file from your stack tester, you can hopefully be able to import this data into StackVision or Prism and save yourself the trouble of hand enter. I'm going to assume that we're going to have the ability to hand enter all this information, but you can see that it's a lot of detailed information. And if you had to hand enter it, it would take you quite a while to do it. And I would like to encourage you not to rely upon hand entry. That if you can get a file from your vendor, from your stack testers, I should say, and importing the data into the database would be a much easier and much simpler way of doing it. And so you can also see here that I mentioned that the sections 2 through 13 make up the data elements for your quarterly compliance reports. Again, those begin the first quarter of 2024. Section 13 is for reporting those deviation events. And then sections 14 through 31, as we just saw, contain the specific data elements related to the various types of rate of reference method procedures. And again, the section are used to report the reference method data recorded and the results derived by the stack testers in support of those performance tests. And so if you haven't ever had to import a file from the stack testers, this is something that you're going to have to begin working with them to understand what's involved. So be prepared to spend some time working on this. Now, as we reach the end of this presentation, let's talk about wrapping all this stuff up. One other thing I wanted to mention is that we've heard from Chris Worley at ECMPS support that there's another technical correction coming out related to the MATS rule. And he didn't explain the nature of that technical correction, nor was he able to say when it was going to be released. But since he mentioned it at our user group meeting back in November, I thought I would pass it along to you that there is this technical correction that they're anticipating. And if your unit is a MATS affected unit, and that would be a coal-fired boiler and some oil-fired boilers, you really need to review this final MATS rule to understand how it's going to impact you. And what I tried to do today is bring to your attention some of the more significant or important changes that have occurred, to raise your awareness and to encourage you to spend the time investigating these changes and how they impact your compliance strategy. I'm also going to mention that getting ready for these new reporting changes will be no simple task. You really need to set aside the time and resources to prepare yourself for this. And as we move forward with the new ECMPS tool, the EPA will have beta testing periods where you can practice making changes to the monitoring plan records, practice making changes using the new tool for evaluating QA files. And you can practice importing emission files in the JSON format and evaluating them with the new tool. And I would strongly urge you to take the time in 2022 and 2023 to use these beta testing periods to work out the bugs, and do not wait until 2024 to begin working on these things. It'll be just too much work to overcome and to get a handle on. So that's the last of my slides. Are there any questions that anybody has for me? Please raise your hand or type them in.
Hi, Jon. I've got some questions for you.
Okay.
I'll start with the first one. The question is, so Q4 2023 data will be reported in the new manner in 2024? I think they're asking, will Q4 2023 data be reported in this new way in 2024? Is that correct?
Yeah, they're asking if the fourth quarter data, which gets reported in January of 2024, is required to be used to use the new tool that's replacing ECMPS. And I've asked this question of Chris Worley, and he said yes, starting January 1st of 2024, you'll be required to use the new tool. I too am a little confused if that means the fourth quarter of 2023 is being reported using the new tool in January, or is it required that January 1st is the first day that you have to use the new tool? Like I said, he said that you have to start using it on January 1st, and therefore, since you're reporting the fourth quarter, I would presume that that's what that's going to mean. But as we get closer to that deadline, I fully expect we'll get more details and more information from Chris to help us better understand how this is going to impact us. I hope that was clear enough.
The second question is, the diluent downtime isn't included in the Mercury rate downtime, correct?
I think you're asking if you're using a diluent monitor as part of your calculation for the mercury emission rate, then if the diluent monitor is unavailable and not producing valid data, and then therefore you cannot calculate a valid hourly mercury emission rate, the diluent monitor does impact the downtime reported for that monitoring system because it is a component of the system. I hope that clarifies.
I've got another question for you. Do you know if the percent of downtime will be increased? I am currently required to have 95% availability.
I have no idea if the amount of downtime is going to change. I want to point out that this interpretation of downtime and the associated deviation periods is unique to the MATS reporting program. And so that's why I brought it up, because it can be very confusing as compared to what people are previously understood as being acceptable. So to me, if in the past people were reporting downtime on a monitor by monitor basis, let's use a NOx and CO2 monitoring system, for example. If you were reporting NOx downtime on that NOx monitor, you would report that separately. If you had downtime for the diluent monitor, you would report that separately. But under this way, you would report downtime for the system of the NOx pound per million BTU system. So will it cause more downtime? I'm afraid it might, but I really can't say for sure. It's hard to understand at this moment how it might or might not. I hope that helped.
The next question, do the sections listed in Appendix E become applicable in 2014 Q1, or are some of them applicable now?
The sections of Appendix E we know that they become applicable on the first quarter of 2024. Whether or not they are applicable now, I can't say definitively, because I really suggest you'd have to look at each one of them and to see first, are they relevant to your situation? And second, they probably are not required to be used today, but as you put together your semi-annual compliance report, if there's something that you have not been reporting today, and they are required under Appendix E, you might want to consider including them, even though you don't have to follow them. So I know for sure that they are in effect starting the first quarter of 2024, but I am unsure whether they are required now.
All right, yes, I think they meant to say 2024 and accidentally typed 2014. The next question is, will the quarterly reporting replace using ECMPS to submit stack testing results?
Yes, yes. The various sections in Appendix E do contain the elements that the EPA requires that you submit for the stack testing data and results. And so, yes, Appendix E will become the required method for submitting stack testing data electronically into EPA.
Next one, will ESC Spectrum develop a tool to enable import of CSV for import into StackVision? What about the new JSON format, which will be in place prior to Q1 2024?
First off, let me just say to you that I know from my own personal experience that for StackVision, you can import CSV files already related to method 2, various types of method 2 flow measurements. That has already been done, and I used it myself personally about 10 years ago. I have not touched it since, so I don't know the status of that at the moment. Now, I can tell you that I have suggested to the development people at ESC that they need to expand that functionality for importing data and develop some sort of a standard or a checklist that our customers can hand to their stack testers and say, in the future, we need to import this data into our database so that we can electronically upload it to EPA. Therefore, starting in 2023 or whenever, I'm requiring you, the stack testers, to give me the results both in a hard copy report and in a CSV file so that I can import the data directly into the database and avoid making multiple manual entry errors. So do I know that ESC Spectrum is doing this? My answer is no, I do not personally know, but I certainly hope that they are planning on doing it.
A follow-up question to that, are you aware of a tool that testers can use to create the CSV or JSON files for import into StackVision?
I am not aware of a tool that is available. I personally am not aware of it. I don't know if there is. I just know that the stack testing company that I used to use when I was a utility person was able to give me a file to import a CSV file to import a method 2 data into StackVision. So I know that that particular vendor could do it. And that was more than 10 years ago. So yes, we certainly need to help you understand what's going to be required so that you can successfully import these data files into the database.
Carrie, I will pass your questions along to the customer support team and have someone get back with you to better answer your question and see if they can provide some guidance. Next question, what sources do these MATS rules changes impact?
Well, these changes impact a facility that's first MATS affected, but also depends upon their monitoring strategy. So for example, some people show compliance to the MATS requirements by doing stack testing, periodic stack testing. And so therefore the changes that are proposed for reporting of those stack testing results will impact them. Other people use averaging plans. And so the changes that were proposed to the averaging plan reporting requirements will impact those people. A lot of people use CEM systems to either measure mercury or PM or a SO2 and a diluent system as a surrogate for acid gases. And so the changes that were proposed back in September will, as I kind of described, will impact them. So it's very much, the impact of these changes is very much site specific, meaning it depends upon what you already are using for your compliance purposes for MATS reporting. I hope that clarifies it for you.
All right, the next question. Will 30-D or 90-D facility average data be reported electronically?
Yes, it's in Appendix E. I don't recall off the top of my head what section, but that's where I believe today you're required to submit your 30-day averages on a PDF file, and reporting those 30 and 90-day averages electronically through Appendix E will replace that hard copy submission.
I think this is the most questions we've ever had, John. Do you believe that SIMS downtime as a result of planned maintenance activities, such as planned probe maintenance, would not be reportable as a deviation?
I believe, and again, this is where someone who probably has more experience than I can comment, give you a better answer. But I believe that if you have preventative maintenance work that is included or called out in your site-specific monitoring plan, that's required and you're required to have one under the MATS reporting rule. I believe that if it's maintenance work is specified in that site-specific monitoring plan, that is still classified as downtime, but it's not a deviation. Now, that's my opinion. I might be wrong. And the reason I say that is that yesterday, Agora Environmental, which used to be R&B Consulting, they had a webinar yesterday to talk specifically about MATS downtime and deviation reporting. And that was one of the topics they brought up yesterday, that certain maintenance activities still will cause downtime, but they're not considered to be deviations if they are specified in your site-specific monitoring plans. And that was the first time I ever heard that, so I'm not completely familiar with or comfortable with that interpretation. But I suggest if that is something that you should be looking at to make sure you fully understand what periods of what portions of downtime periods are to be considered deviations and which ones cannot or don't have to be considered to be deviations. It still is unclear to me, and I need to work on understanding that better myself. So I'm glad you raised the question and brought the topic up. I just don't have a good answer for anybody today because I just haven't had a chance to study it enough.
On what date did the requirements of Appendix C and D become effective?
Well, as a general rule, any rule that's promulgated in the Federal Register goes into effect on that day it appears in the Federal Register, unless it contains a different date. So it is my presumption that unless something was stated in those appendices that you just referenced, that they would go into effect on a date other than September 9th, they went into effect September 9th.
Thanks, John.
And certainly, if you have any questions, call me or email me, and I'll do my best to answer them. This is still a very developing topic. We may not have the answers today, but we'll certainly do our best to try to help point you in the right direction. I also want to point out that when it comes to MATS, the MATS reporting program, that your local state agencies have delegated authority, which means that is different than it is compared to the acid rain program. The acid rain program is administered by the Clean Air Markets Division. And therefore, you kind of have the programs apply equally across the whole United States. But that's not the case with the MATS program. The EPA decided to give the states delegated authority. And so each state has the final word on all this sort of stuff. So if you go call your state agency up today and you ask them some of the detailed questions you've been asking me, they may not be able to give you the answer because they're not familiar with it either. There are people in the EPA's office, OAQPS, who are involved with the MATS program. And I can't think of the name of the individual right at the moment. I can't think of his name, but anyways, that's who I would contact and ask my questions of them directly, since they're the ones that wrote the regulations. So, if you have questions going forward, certainly send me an email or reach out to me, and I'll do my best.
Great. Well, thank you, Jon. Really appreciate you taking your time out today and putting together such complete and specific slides on this important topic.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. I hope I was able to help you at least some small direction.
Great. All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a wonderful day.